I used to believe blood was the most sacred bond until the night I found my 19-year-old disabled nephew collapsing from the cold on my front porch. The monster who pushed him toward death in 32-degree weather was his own biological father, who immediately played the victim to blame me. Some people will destroy their family for greed, but they forget that survivors always know how to use the truth to flip the board completely. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Caroline Bishop. My entire life revolves around logistics, tight schedules, and surviving the brutal graveyard shift. I work as a night route dispatcher for Aegis Freight Systems, a major transport hub located right in the industrial sector of Denver. My job is to monitor weather patterns, navigate sudden road closures, and keep our long-haul drivers safe when they cross dangerous mountain passes. I am accustomed to dealing with crisis and panic. I handle stress for a living. But absolutely nothing in my professional training could have prepared me for the nightmare waiting on my own front porch. It was 2 in the morning. The temperature outside had plummeted to exactly 32 degrees, hovering right at the freezing point, though the aggressive wind chill made it feel infinitely worse. Denver winters are notoriously unforgiving, but that specific night felt deliberately cruel. The wind was howling, a high-pitched shriek that rattled the street lamps and tore through the barren branches of the trees lining my street. The air felt like walking through a wall of shattered glass. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift at the dispatch center. My eyes were burning from staring at bright radar screens, and my bones ached with a deep, settling exhaustion. All I wanted was to lock my front door, turn my thermostat up to 80 degrees, and collapse into bed. I turned my sedan onto my dark residential street, the headlights cutting through the swirling flurries of sleet. As I pulled into my driveway, the high beams swept across the front of my house. For a split second, I thought a stray dog or a massive pile of discarded tarp had blown onto my front steps. A dark, shapeless mass was huddled against the concrete base of the porch. I put my car in park, leaving the engine running and the headlights glaring directly at the steps. I stepped out into the biting cold, pulling my thick woolen coat tightly around my chest. I took one cautious step forward, squinting through the harsh glare of the halogen lights. The wind screamed past my ears, deafening me. The dark mass shifted slightly. A pale, violently shivering hand reached out toward the light. My heart stopped dead in my chest. It was a person. I sprinted across the frost-covered grass, dropping my heavy purse onto the frozen ground. I fell to my knees on the unforgiving concrete, gasping as I grabbed the trembling shoulders of the figure. I turned him over, pushing back the thin frost-stiffened hood of his jacket. The world around me instantly vanished into a void of pure horror. It was Julian, my nephew. He was only 19 years old, an adult by law, but trapped in a physical form that constantly betrayed him. Julian suffered from congenital muscle degeneration. He was a brilliant, gentle young man who relied entirely on heavy leg braces and forearm crutches just to walk from a living room to a kitchen. Without his mobility aids, he was completely defenseless. I looked around frantically in the freezing darkness. His crutches were nowhere to be seen. Julian was in the advanced stages of severe hypothermia. His lips were a terrifying, violent shade of blue, and his skin was ghostly white, as cold as solid marble. His eyes were rolled back, his eyelids fluttering weakly against the sleet. He was completely unresponsive when I screamed his name. His breathing was terribly shallow, just faint puffs of mist escaping his trembling mouth. He was dying right in front of me. Panic, raw and blinding, seized my throat. I grabbed him by the arms, struggling against his dead weight. His muscles were severely atrophied, making him somewhat lighter than an average 19-year-old. Yet lifting him alone was an agonizing effort. I dragged him up the concrete stairs, my boots slipping on the slick ice, my own muscles screaming in protest. I kicked the front door open, hauling his freezing frame over the threshold into the hallway. I slammed the door shut, instantly cutting off the lethal howling wind. I dragged him onto the living room rug and sprinted to the hall closet, tearing the doors open. I pulled out my heavy winter comforter, a thick wool blanket, and every thermal throw I owned. I raced back and piled them on top of him, wrapping him tightly, tucking the edges under his shivering body to create a cocoon of trapped heat. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket and dialed 911. Emergency services. What is your location? The dispatcher asked. I shouted my address, my voice echoing off the walls. I need an ambulance immediately. I have a severely disabled 19-year-old male suffering from extreme hypothermia. His lips are blue and he is slipping into a coma. Units are being dispatched now, the operator replied. Keep him awake. Use dry blankets and your own body heat. I threw my phone onto the floor on speaker mode and knelt beside Julian. I rubbed his freezing hands aggressively between mine, trying to force friction and warmth into his completely numb fingers. I slapped his pale cheeks lightly, calling his name over and over again, begging him to open his eyes. His eyelashes fluttered. His jaw trembled so violently, I thought his teeth would shatter. He managed to crack his eyes open just a fraction. His gaze was glassy, unfocused, and filled with a profound, soul-crushing terror. I leaned my ear close to his mouth. He was trying to speak, but his vocal cords were frozen, producing only ragged, broken gasps. Julian, stay with me. The ambulance is coming. What happened? How did you get here? I pleaded, my voice breaking. He drew in a sharp, rattling breath. His chest heaved painfully under the mountain of heavy blankets. He pushed me, Julian whispered. The words were incredibly faint, scraping out of his throat like coarse sandpaper. I froze. My blood turned to absolute ice, completely independent of the weather outside. Who? Who pushed you? Julian squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped, tracing a warm line down his frozen cheek. Dad. He drove me here, pushed me out, took my crutches, drove away. The silence that followed in my living room was deafening. Marcus, his own father, my own brother. Marcus had driven his severely disabled son into a freezing winter storm, physically thrown him onto the concrete pavement, confiscated his only means of mobility, and abandoned him in 32-degree weather to freeze to death in the dead of night. A sickening wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me, burning away all the remaining panic. This was no accident. This was a calculated execution. In the distance, the faint, wailing sound of emergency sirens began to pierce through the howling wind outside. But in my mind, a completely different kind of alarm was ringing. The war had just begun. The glaring fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit waiting area hummed violently above my head, casting a sickly pale glow over the sterile white walls. It had been roughly 45 minutes since the paramedics rushed my nephew through the automatic sliding glass doors, hooking him up to thermal-regulating intravenous fluids and advanced cardiac monitors. The overwhelming smell of harsh industrial floor cleaner and medical-grade alcohol was making me incredibly nauseous. I sat on a rigid plastic chair, my work clothes still damp from the freezing sleet, staring blankly at the restricted access double doors, before I could even process a single coherent thought about his chances of recovery. The heavy wooden doors of the main waiting room burst open with violent force. My brother, Marcus, stormed into the quiet corridor like a hurricane. Clinging tightly to his left arm was his fiancée, Victoria, a woman who possessed an alarming, highly practiced talent for theatrical distress. Flanking them, completely altering the gravity of the entire situation, were two fully uniformed city police officers with their hands resting defensively on their utility belts. Marcus did not merely walk toward the reception desk. He lunged. He collapsed heavily against the edge of the nurse's station counter, burying his face in his hands, letting out a series of loud, agonizing sobs that echoed down the quiet hallway and startled the medical staff. It was a flawless, Oscar-worthy performance of a devastated, heartbroken father. "Where is my boy?" Marcus wailed, his voice cracking with perfectly manufactured grief. "What has she done to my son?" He suddenly whirled around, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto me. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Arrest her right now! She took him! She dragged my crippled boy out of his warm bed in the middle of the night and left him to die in the freezing street." Victoria immediately escalated the performance. She started sobbing uncontrollably, burying her face into Marcus's shoulder, acting as the perfect, horrified witness to my supposed cruelty. I stood up from the plastic chair, my mind completely stunned by the sheer audacity of the lie. Marcus stepped aggressively toward the officers, fresh tears streaming down his face. "We had a terrible argument about our family estate just 2 days ago. She was furious about the property division and the trust funds. She told me she would make me pay for cutting her out. I never, in a million years, thought she would use my severely disabled son to get her sick revenge." One of the officers, a tall, heavily built man with a severe expression, immediately stepped between Marcus and me. His posture instantly shifted into an aggressive, dominant stance, treating me as an immediate threat. "Ma'am, do not take another step forward," he commanded sharply, his hand resting securely on his radio. Marcus frantically pulled his high-end smartphone from his expensive designer coat pocket. Look right here. Officer, I have the absolute proof," he cried out, shoving the brightly illuminated screen directly into the policeman's face. "These are the text messages she sent me earlier tonight. She broke into my house while we were asleep, dragged him into her car, and dumped him on her own porch just to frame me because I threatened to cut off her inheritance. She texted me that I would regret crossing her." I stared in absolute, paralyzing disbelief as the officers scrolled through the glowing screen. Marcus had meticulously doctored a completely fake text message thread. Through some sophisticated digital editing application, he had created an exact, flawless replica of my contact profile, generating horrible messages that explicitly threatened to teach him a permanent, devastating lesson. The lead officer's eyes hardened dramatically. He turned to me, his gaze laced with profound, unmistakable disgust. "Caroline Bishop, based on this preliminary evidence and the victim's critical condition, you are currently the primary suspect in the aggravated assault, kidnapping, and felony neglect of a vulnerable adult." The second officer pulled out a leather-bound notepad, stepping uncomfortably close to my personal space, trying to intimidate me into a confession. "Did you forcefully remove a 19-year-old disabled male from his legal residence tonight? Did you transport him in your personal vehicle and intentionally leave him exposed to freezing temperatures to settle a financial dispute?" the officer demanded, his voice echoing loudly for the entire intensive care ward to hear. The steel jaws of the trap snapped shut in my mind. The sheer brilliance of my brother's sociopathic plan unfolded before my eyes in terrifying clarity. He had not just tried to murder his own son, he had orchestrated a flawless, multi-layered scenario to simultaneously eliminate me. If I panicked, if I screamed the truth about what Julian had whispered to me, I would sound exactly like a hysterical, cornered liar caught red-handed. The fake messages were the perfect physical evidence to counter any frantic, emotional accusations I made. Marcus stood safely behind the broad shoulders of the officers, wiping a fake tear from his cheek with the back of his hand. But his eyes were dead and focused, locked intensely onto mine. In those dark, unblinking pupils, I saw pure, malicious triumph. He was desperately waiting for me to explode. He wanted me to look unhinged, dangerous, and guilty. The injustice of the situation burned in my chest like swallowing battery acid. My nephew was fighting for his life less than 50 feet away from where we stood, and his attempted murderer was currently receiving absolute sympathy and protection from the local police force. Every instinct in my biological makeup screamed at me to lunge at Marcus, to tear his smug face apart, to scream the truth until my throat bled. But logic, cold, sharp, and unforgiving, overrode my burning fury. The police had already made up their minds based on the digital forgery. To them, I was a vicious, greedy aunt who tortured a disabled boy for cash. Defending myself to these aggressively biased officers without legal representation would be absolute, irreversible suicide. I took a deep, incredibly stabilizing breath, forcing my racing heart rate to slow down. I looked the lead officer directly in the eye. I kept my facial expression entirely blank, completely devoid of the chaotic panic Marcus so desperately wanted to see. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not shed a single tear. I am officially invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, I stated clearly, my voice as calm and cold as the ice storm raging outside the hospital windows. I absolutely refuse to answer any of your questions without representation, and I demand to speak to my civil defense attorney immediately. Marcus's fake sobbing hitched and paused for a fraction of a second. He did not expect silence. He expected a chaotic, highly incriminating fight. The officers exchanged a frustrated glance, realizing I was not going to give them the easy confession they wanted. The battle lines were officially drawn, and I was going to need an army to fight back. The police ordered me not to leave the hospital premises, but absolutely refused to let me anywhere near the intensive care unit where my nephew was fighting for his life. I retreated to a deserted corner of the hospital cafeteria, the stale scent of burnt coffee and harsh chemical disinfectants, doing nothing to mask the metallic taste of raw fear in my mouth. I sat alone at a wobbly plastic table, watching the digital clock on the wall tick relentlessly toward dawn. I had exactly one strategic move left to play. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person who could possibly navigate this highly weaponized legal nightmare. Arthur Sterling was not a warm, empathetic family counselor. He was a ruthless, razor-sharp civil litigator who treated the judicial system like a high-stakes chessboard. A man who did not believe in coincidences, only in highly calculated strategies. I explained the entire situation to him in rapid, hushed tones, detailing the brilliantly forged text messages, the aggressive attitude of the police officers, and the terrifying reality of my brother's framing tactic. Arthur told me to stay exactly where I was and keep my mouth completely shut. He arrived within 45 minutes, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and wearing an expression of pure, unadulterated skepticism regarding the local precinct's handling of the evidence. We sat in the darkest corner of the cafeteria. I needed to understand the core motivation. Marcus was an arrogant narcissist and an emotional bully, but he was also fundamentally lazy, orchestrating a violent crime of this magnitude, risking decades in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder, required a catalyst far more powerful than a simple, petty sibling rivalry. It required massive, life-altering greed. "We need to follow the money, Caroline," Arthur stated, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely carried across the table. "People do not abandon their own disabled children to freeze to death in 32-degree weather simply because they are angry about a minor dispute. They do it to protect a massive financial asset. Tell me everything you know about the late mother's estate." Julian's mother, Eleanor, had come from a highly successful, generationally wealthy family heavily invested in the commercial real estate sector. She tragically passed away when Julian was only 7 years old, leaving behind a massive, incredibly lucrative investment portfolio. I had always known Julian was well provided for, but I never knew the exact details of the legal structure, because Marcus fiercely and aggressively guarded that specific information from everyone in the family. Arthur opened his laptop right there on the cafeteria table, utilizing his specialized, high-clearance legal database access to pull up the public probate court records from 12 years ago. As his eyes quickly scanned the glowing screen, a chillingly calm realization settled over his sharp features. He slowly turned the laptop toward me. "Look closely at these dates, Caroline," Arthur instructed, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the screen. "Julian was born on December 12th. Today is December 9th. Your nephew is exactly 3 days away from his 20th birthday. And according to Eleanor's ironclad trust documents, 20 years old is the exact age of maturity where Julian gains 100% unrestricted control over the entire principal amount." I stared at the financial figures boldly highlighted on the screen. my stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss of horror. The estate was not just a comfortable safety net, it was valued at over $12 million. For the past 13 years, Marcus had been the sole managing trustee. He had spent over a decade acting like a self-made titan of industry, but his entire lavish existence was funded by skimming astronomical administrative fees off his dead wife's money. It funded his expensive sports cars, his luxury vacations, and the massive diamond ring currently sitting on Victoria's finger. In exactly 72 hours, that endless river of cash was going to permanently and legally dry up. Marcus would lose absolutely everything, completely cut off from the wealth he felt entirely entitled to. But Arthur was not finished. He scrolled down to a specific, heavily highlighted legal clause buried deep within the complex trust documents. "This is the kill switch," Arthur murmured, his eyes narrowing with deep professional disgust. Eleanor knew her son had severe, lifelong medical challenges. She included a specific medical contingency clause. If Julian is ever deemed legally incapacitated, deemed mentally unfit to manage his own financial affairs, or requires permanent institutionalization in a long-term psychiatric or intensive care facility, the primary trustee retains full, indefinite control of all assets until the beneficiary's death. The absolute, horrifying brilliance of Marcus's plan hit me with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. By dragging Julian out into the freezing storm and abandoning him on the concrete without his crutches, Marcus was not just trying to cause physical harm. He was deliberately manufacturing a severe medical crisis. If Julian suffered permanent brain damage from the severe hypothermia, or if the sheer trauma caused a complete mental breakdown, Marcus could easily petition a judge for permanent guardianship. And the second phase of his plan was equally as evil. By framing me for the crime using those fake text messages, he achieved a perfect, devastating double strike. He permanently eliminated the only family member who actively advocated for Julian's independence, and he guaranteed that I would spend the next 20 years locked in a state penitentiary, entirely unable to challenge his absolute authority over the $12 million. Just as the horrific reality of the situation fully settled over me, my phone vibrated with a message from a sympathetic night shift nurse I knew in the intensive care unit. Julian had finally regained consciousness. His core body temperature had stabilized just enough for the police detectives to conduct a preliminary interview at his bedside. Arthur and I rushed up to the third floor, standing helplessly behind the glass observation window as the lead detective leaned over Julian's bed. Through the slightly ajar hospital door, I could clearly hear my nephew's weak, painfully raspy voice. "My dad did it," Julian breathed out, his vocal cords still severely damaged from the freezing air. "He drove me. He pushed me out. He left me there." A fierce spark of hope flared in my chest for a fleeting second, but it was instantly extinguished. Marcus stepped directly into the hospital room, flanked by his own high-priced personal lawyer. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly sad. He reached into his briefcase and handed the lead detective a thick, officially stamped medical file. "I warned you this would happen, Detective," Marcus said, his voice dripping with fake, heartbroken sympathy as he wiped a perfectly timed tear from his eye. "Julian suffers from chronic, agonizing pain due to his muscle degeneration. We have been consulting with a private pain management specialist for months. The heavy doses of narcotic painkillers he takes daily have a documented, severe side effect of opiate-induced psychosis and paranoid delusions. He genuinely believes these terrifying hallucinations are real. It absolutely breaks my heart, but his mind is completely shattered." The detective flipped through the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation Marcus had undoubtedly purchased for a massive sum from a corrupt private clinic. The document explicitly detailed non-existent episodes of severe paranoia, aggressively labeling Julian as a highly unreliable witness trapped in a state of constant medical delirium. The detective's rigid posture visibly softened toward Marcus. He looked down at Julian not with a sense of seeking justice, but with overwhelming, dismissive pity. "Rest up, son. Your father is right here to take care of you," the officer said gently. completely dismissing Julian's agonizing plea for help as the mad, confused ramblings of a heavily medicated, mentally unstable patient. Arthur pulled me away from the observation window, steering me forcibly back down the sterile hallway before I could lose my temper and scream. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely feel my fingertips. My brother had completely rigged the entire system. He had successfully weaponized his own son's severe disability, manipulated the police force with expertly forged digital texts, and legally invalidated the victim's only truthful testimony with fraudulent purchased psychiatric records. "The police will officially issue a warrant for your arrest by tomorrow morning," Arthur stated grimly as he pressed the button for the main lobby elevator. "Your testimony is already dismissed as the desperate lies of a cornered suspect. Julian's testimony is legally voided by those fake medical records, right now, in the eyes of the law. Marcus is the grieving hero protecting his sick boy, and you are the dangerous monster." I stared at my pale reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. My eyes were dark and exhausted, but they were suddenly burning with a cold. Absolute clarity. Words were entirely useless. Emotional pleas for justice were useless. In a war fought with manufactured lies, corrupted doctors, and forged digital documents, the truth spoken from a hospital bed was simply not enough to tip the heavy scales of justice, to break Marcus, to completely obliterate his perfect, untouchable facade, and save my nephew from a lifetime trapped in a psychiatric prison. I needed something entirely different. I needed absolute, physical, irrefutable proof that no high-priced lawyer or corrupt specialist could ever wave away. And standing there in that elevator, I knew exactly where to find it. Arthur dropped me off at my house just before dawn. The freezing wind had finally died down, leaving a heavy, dead silence over the snow-covered neighborhood. The police tape was still strung across my front porch, a glaring yellow reminder that I was currently the prime suspect in a horrific felony, but standing there in the freezing driveway, staring at the empty space where I had found Julian hours earlier, the fog of panic completely lifted from my brain. It was replaced by a sharp, calculating, and almost mechanical clarity. I did not need to rely on the biased, manipulative police department to find the truth. I had my own resources. I turned my head and looked at the large, heavy-duty Aegis Freight Systems incident response truck parked right next to where I had left my personal sedan. As a senior route dispatcher, I was frequently required to conduct on-site terminal inspections, which meant I always had a company-issued fleet vehicle assigned to my residence. This was not just a regular truck. Aegis transported billions of dollars in high-value commercial freight across the country to combat cargo theft and liability fraud. Every single company vehicle was equipped with a military-grade surveillance system. The heavy-duty truck facing the street had a high-definition, wide-angle dashboard camera mounted behind the rear-view mirror. It operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, utilizing advanced infrared night vision. But the most crucial detail was its architecture. The system did not record to a local memory card that could be easily removed or tampered with. It was hardwired directly into a cellular transmitter, constantly uploading an encrypted, unalterable feed of video and global positioning data straight to the Aegis corporate cloud servers. Nobody, not even the driver, could pause, delete, or modify the footage. I ran inside my house, locked the door, and immediately booted up my work laptop. I connected to the secure corporate virtual private network and dialed the direct extension for the Aegis Cybersecurity and Fleet Monitoring Division. It was 4:30 in the morning, but our transport network never slept. A network security engineer named David, a brilliant and notoriously meticulous analyst, picked up the line. "David, this is Caroline Bishop from Night Dispatch," I said, my voice completely steady and commanding. "I have a highly critical security emergency regarding my assigned fleet vehicle. I need you to access the cloud mainframe and run a direct server extraction for the forward-facing camera on Unit 730. I need the continuous footage from midnight to 2 o'clock in the morning, specifically focusing on the timeline right outside my residential address, David did not ask any unnecessary questions. I could hear his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. He verified my security credentials, bypassed the standard administrative red tape, and accessed the raw, unedited server logs. Within 10 minutes, he initiated a secure, encrypted file transfer directly to my local machine. I watched the download progress bar inch across my screen, my heart pounding a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. When the transfer completed, I opened the high-resolution video file. The image was incredibly sharp, the infrared sensors rendering the dark, freezing street in crystal-clear grayscale. At exactly 1 hour and 14 minutes past midnight, a sleek, heavily customized luxury sports car abruptly swerved into the frame, violently scraping its tires against the icy curb directly in front of my house. The license plate was illuminated perfectly by the street lamp. It was unmistakably my brother's expensive German import. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath hitching in my throat as the passenger side door swung open. The camera captured everything with terrifying clarity. Marcus stepped out of the driver's side, walked aggressively around the hood of the car, and grabbed Julian by the collar of his winter jacket. He physically dragged his disabled son out of the passenger seat. Julian was clearly struggling, his weakened legs completely unable to support his weight on the slippery, ice-covered concrete. He collapsed heavily against the frozen ground. Then, the final, undeniable act of pure malice played out on the screen. Marcus reached into the back seat of the sports car, pulled out Julian's specialized forearm crutches, and viciously threw them into the deep, snow-filled bushes across the yard, completely out of reach. He did not say a single word. He did not hesitate. He simply slammed the car doors shut, jogged back to the driver's seat, and aggressively accelerated down the street, leaving his son to die in the freezing darkness. The digital timestamp flashing in the bottom right corner of the video player was the ultimate weapon. It anchored the crime to an exact, indisputable moment in time. But to make this evidence absolutely bulletproof in a court of law, I needed to preemptively destroy the fake text messages Marcus had given the police. I opened a secondary portal on my laptop and accessed my own employee telemetry files. I downloaded my digital terminal punch clock records, my physical security keycard swipe logs at the dispatch center doors, and the active network routing data from my dispatcher workstation. I also logged into my cellular provider's web portal, pulling my raw phone tower geolocation pings for that exact time frame. The combined data created an impenetrable wall of truth. It explicitly proved, through 5 different, independently verified tracking systems, that at 1 hour and 14 minutes past midnight, when Marcus was abandoning Julian on my porch, I was actively managing a freight crisis from my desk at the Aegis terminal, exactly 32 miles away. The text messages Marcus claimed I sent him from his driveway were mathematically and physically impossible. I meticulously copied the encrypted surveillance video, the company login ledgers, and the cellular tracking logs onto a military-grade, password-protected solid-state hard drive. I placed the small, heavy metal drive carefully into my coat pocket. It felt like a loaded weapon. My brother believed he was an untouchable genius who could manipulate the law with his wealth and his theatrical lies. He completely forgot that he was dealing with a woman who spent her entire professional life tracking, securing, and verifying data across thousands of miles. The trap was set, the evidence was absolute, and I was finally ready to end his reign of terror. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, the heavy winter sun finally broke through the gray Denver clouds, but the atmosphere inside the hospital corridors remained suffocatingly tense. I walked back through the sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit, the solid-state hard drive resting securely in the right pocket of my wool coat. I did not come alone. Arthur walked closely by my side, his presence a silent, imposing warning to anyone who thought they could steamroll me. As we approached Julian's private recovery room, the chaotic noise of a heated argument echoed down the sterile hallway. A crowd of nervous nurses and a deeply uncomfortable hospital administrator were gathered just outside the open doorway. Standing at the center of the commotion, completely dominating the space, was Marcus. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, looking less like a concerned father and more like a ruthless corporate raider preparing for a hostile takeover. Beside him stood a slick, overly polished private attorney, waving a thick stack of legal documents with aggressive theatrical authority. "I hold the absolute, legally binding medical power of attorney," Marcus bellowed, his voice echoing loudly off the linoleum floors. He slammed a heavy file onto the medical cart next to the administrator. "My son is currently suffering from severe narcotic-induced psychosis. I have the signed psychiatric evaluation right here in my hand. I am demanding his immediate forced transfer to the Pine Ridge Behavioral Health Center. I have an exclusive to private medical transport unit waiting at the loading dock this exact second." The hospital administrator, a weary-looking woman in a white coat, tried to intervene, holding her hands up defensively. "Sir, the patient just survived extreme hypothermia. His core temperature stabilized only 4 hours ago. Moving him to an isolated psychiatric ward is completely against our primary medical advice and protocol." Marcus leaned forward, invading her personal space with terrifying, unhinged aggression. "If you do not release my son into my legal custody right now, I will personally sue this hospital, the board of directors, and every single doctor on this floor for medical kidnapping and gross negligence. I will absolutely destroy your careers and bankrupt this facility." Just inside the hospital room, 2 police officers from the previous night were standing uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to handle the rapidly escalating legal threats. Marcus spotted me walking down the corridor, and his face instantly twisted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. "And why is she still walking around free?" Marcus screamed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest as I approached. "She is a violent criminal. I gave you the text messages. She dragged my crippled boy out into the freezing snow to die. Handcuff her right now. I want her arrested and thrown in a cell before she tries to murder anyone else in my family." To amplify the engineered drama, Victoria stepped out from the corner of the room. She was holding her expensive smartphone high in the air, the screen glowing brightly to indicate an active live stream. She had her makeup perfectly smudged to mimic hours of hysterical crying. "Please, everyone sharing this stream, you need to see the absolute monster my husband is dealing with," Victoria cried into the camera, broadcasting her fake agony to thousands of online viewers. "This is Caroline Bishop. She is a bitter, greedy, evil woman who physically tortured our disabled 19-year-old son just because she was cut out of a family inheritance. She left him in 32-degree weather. We are living an absolute nightmare, and the corrupt police are just letting her walk right into his hospital room." She aggressively panned the camera directly toward my face, heavily anticipating a violent, hysterical reaction. They both wanted me to scream. They desperately needed me to lunge at them, to knock the phone out of Victoria's hand, to act like the unhinged, violent sociopath they had painted me to be. A viral video of me losing my mind in an intensive care unit would be the final, undeniable piece of public evidence to seal my fate. I stepped directly into the hospital room, crossing the threshold with slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered footsteps. The air in the room was incredibly thick, charged with the dangerous, crackling electricity of a live explosive. Julian was lying quietly on the hospital bed, hooked up to a dozen monitors, his eyes wide and terrified as he watched his father aggressively terrorize the medical staff. I walked past the shouting police officers. I walked right past Victoria and her glowing camera lens. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from my brother. Marcus braced his stance, his shoulders tensing, his eyes wide with adrenaline, fully expecting a physical attack or a screaming match. He opened his mouth to deliver another vicious, humiliating insult designed to break me. "You are absolute garbage. Caroline," Marcus spat, his face turning red with manufactured rage. "A pathetic, lonely woman who could never build a life of her own. So you tried to destroy mine. You are going to rot in a federal prison for the rest of your miserable life. And I am going to make sure they throw away the key." I did not raise my hand. I did not raise my voice. I did not even blink. I simply stood there, my posture flawlessly straight, my face as cold and completely unreadable as a carved marble block. I locked my eyes directly onto his. The silence that radiated from me was not the silence of defeat, shock, or fear. It was the terrifying, suffocating silence of absolute dominance. It was the eerie, unnatural calm of an apex predator watching its prey enthusiastically walk directly into a steel trap. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The deafening noise of Marcus's tantrum slowly began to evaporate into the sterile air of the hospital room. The nurses entirely stopped whispering. The police officers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, sensing a drastic, unseen shift in the room's power dynamic. Victoria lowered her phone just a fraction of an inch, her fake, theatrical sobbing faltering as she stared at my completely emotionless face. Marcus's heavy breathing suddenly became shallow. The vicious, confident sneer on his lips slowly began to slip, instantly replaced by a microscopic, uncontrollable tremor at the corner of his mouth. He looked deep into my eyes, searching desperately for the panic, the helpless rage, or the desperate fear he had worked so incredibly hard to manufacture. He found absolutely nothing. My icy, unwavering stare was completely alien to him. I was not playing by his established rules. I was not reacting to his carefully written script. The total, unnatural absence of fear in my posture sent a sudden, violent shockwave of pure paranoia straight through his central nervous system. His perfectly tailored confidence began to violently fracture. A vague, horrifying realization began to dawn in the dark recesses of his mind. He suddenly understood, with sickening clarity, that a cornered animal only stops fighting when it knows it possesses the power to completely destroy its attacker. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Marcus demanded, his voice suddenly losing its booming, theatrical authority. His tone cracked, dropping into a frantic, highly nervous hiss. "Say something! Tell them what you did!" I kept my hands casually buried in my coat pockets, my right hand resting gently against the cold, hard metal of the encrypted storage drive. I allowed a single, chillingly polite smile to touch the absolute corner of my lips, a smile that promised absolute, undeniable destruction. The climax of his perfectly engineered nightmare was finally here. I completely ignored my brother's frantic, trembling demands. I did not give him the satisfaction of a verbal response. I turned my back to him, a deliberate, highly calculated sign of total disrespect. I walked purposefully toward the senior police detective who was standing near the doorway, watching the bizarre scene unfold with deep suspicion. I reached into the right pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out the solid state-encrypted hard drive. I held the cold metal rectangle out to the officer. "Detective," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence of the room with absolute authority. "There is a secure computer monitor right outside at the central nursing station. I strongly suggest you plug this device in and review the enclosed files immediately. It contains high-definition, unalterable corporate surveillance footage captured directly from the driveway of my residence, firmly combined with encrypted cellular tower geolocation ping logs and my corporate dispatch terminal login records from Aegis Freight Systems." The detective frowned deeply, looking from the small device in my hand over to Marcus. He slowly reached out and took the drive. Marcus let out a loud, mocking laugh, but it was a thin, hysterical sound completely devoid of any real confidence. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to maintain his facade of untouchable wealth, but his eyes were darting nervously around the room. We all moved out into the busy hospital hallway. The hospital administrator quickly directed the detective to an open administrative computer terminal on the front desk. The entire floor seemed to hold its breath. Nurses stopped walking. The private attorney Marcus had hired leaned over the desk, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. Victoria followed closely behind us, her smartphone still held high, the camera continuing to broadcast every single second of the unfolding disaster to her massive online audience. The detective plugged the drive into the port. The screen flickered, and the main directory opened. He clicked on the primary video file. The high-resolution media player expanded to fill the entire monitor. The timestamp in the corner read exactly 1 hour and 14 minutes past midnight. The wide-angle infrared lens showed the freezing, snow-covered street outside my house in crystal-clear grayscale. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the sleek, unmistakable shape of Marcus's luxury sports car violently swerved into the frame. The crisp, high-fidelity audio captured the harsh, grating scrape of the expensive tires grinding against the icy curb. Marcus gasped loudly. It was the sound of a man who had just had all the air violently punched out of his lungs. The blood completely drained from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin looking like wet, gray ash. The video continued playing without mercy. The audio picked up the heavy, violent thud as Julian was ruthlessly dragged out of the passenger seat and thrown onto the frozen concrete pavement. The microphone captured Julian's weak, muffled cries for help. Then came the most damning evidence of all. The camera clearly captured Marcus's face as he looked directly into the street lamp's glow. It captured him reaching into the vehicle, grabbing the specialized forearm crutches, and hurling them viciously into the deep snowbanks across the yard. It captured the aggressive roar of the high-performance engine as he immediately sped away into the night, abandoning his severely disabled son to a freezing, agonizing death. The digital global positioning coordinates and the exact timeline were permanently stamped across the bottom of the footage, blinking relentlessly in the silent hospital corridor. Marcus stumbled backward, hitting the wall. His legs seemed to lose all structural integrity. "That is manipulated," he stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "That is entirely fake. She hired someone to edit that. You cannot believe a single second of it." Arthur, standing tall and imposing behind me, spoke up, delivering the fatal blow. "That footage is a direct, encrypted server extraction from a federal transportation contractor. It is military-grade, unalterable data. Furthermore, the login logs securely stored on that drive explicitly prove that Caroline was sitting at her dispatch terminal exactly 32 miles away when you dumped your son on her porch. Your text messages are amateur, fraudulent digital forgeries, and we will easily prove it in federal court." The senior detective did not hesitate for another fraction of a second. He turned away from the glowing screen, his face hardened with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute, burning fury. He reached around to his utility belt and unclipped his heavy metal handcuffs. "Marcus," the detective barked, his voice booming down the hallway, commanding absolute obedience. "You are under arrest for the felony endangerment of a vulnerable adult, attempted murder, severe bodily harm, and filing a fraudulent police report." The detective grabbed Marcus by his expensive suit jacket, forcefully spinning him around and slamming him face first against the hospital wall. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the corridor was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Victoria let out a piercing, terrified shriek. She suddenly realized the catastrophic error she had made. Her phone was still actively broadcasting live. Thousands of anonymous people across the internet had just watched the entire hospital room confrontation. They had clearly heard the audio from the surveillance video playing on the police monitor. They had witnessed Marcus's pathetic, crumbling lies in real time, exposing him as a wealthy, sociopathic monster. The live chat on her screen was scrolling so fast it was a blur of angry, horrified comments. She frantically tried to hit the end broadcast button, but her hands were shaking too violently to tap the screen. In a state of pure, unadulterated panic, she dropped the expensive device onto the linoleum floor and bolted toward the emergency fire exit stairs. She did not make it more than 20 feet. The second police officer sprinted down the corridor, easily catching up to her. He tackled her roughly against the wall just past the elevator banks. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, aiding and abetting a violent felony, and attempting to flee the scene of a crime," the second officer shouted as he forced her manicured hands firmly behind her back, ignoring her loud, theatrical sobbing. The livestream video that Victoria had intended to use as a weapon to completely destroy my reputation had ironically become the ultimate tool of her own absolute destruction. By broadcasting their crimes to the entire world, they had permanently eliminated any possible chance of hiring corrupt lawyers to quietly sweep the incident under the rug. The public outrage was instantaneous and completely overwhelming. 6 months later, the criminal trial took place. It was incredibly brief and absolutely devastating for my brother. Victoria's own viral live stream was officially submitted by the prosecution as the primary evidence, permanently destroying any fabricated defense their expensive legal team tried to present. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely without the possibility of early parole. Victoria received a harsh 8-year sentence for her active role in the conspiracy. Following the criminal convictions, the civil court judge aggressively and permanently stripped Marcus of all administrative rights and legal access to the family trust fund. Julian safely turned 20 years old in the comfort of a highly secure private rehabilitation center. On that exact day, he gained absolute, unrestricted control over his $12 million inheritance. He immediately used a portion of those funds to hire the absolute best neuromuscular specialists and orthopedic surgeons in the entire country. He underwent a series of advanced physical therapies and highly complex reconstructive joint surgeries that drastically improved his daily mobility, substantially reducing his chronic pain. Today, Julian and I live together in a beautiful, sprawling single-story home we purchased in a quiet, sunny neighborhood far away from Denver. The house was custom-built with wide hallways, accessibility ramps, and a massive indoor therapy pool specifically designed to accommodate all of his medical needs. The freezing, terrifying horrors of that dark winter night are entirely behind us. They have been permanently replaced by the warmth of a genuine family, unconditional love, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that no one will ever be allowed to hurt him again. We survived the absolute worst of human greed, and we used the undeniable truth to build a beautiful, free life. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Daisy Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.